the part of the problem is we don't know whether there's a rise or a drop in white supremacist activity because nobody actually tracks white supremacist violence. The government doesn't track white supremacist violence. So there's no objective criteria for counting and accounting for the rise and fall. Typically you have private entities that try to collect this violence, or try to collect data about this violence, but what they're actually reporting is media reports of this violence. And the media reports typically follow the police reports. And what we know is that the police are reluctant to work many of these cases. For hate crimes, for example, the data that's usually referenced in media reports is the uniform crime reports, but we know that only 12.6% of law enforcement agencies actually acknowledge that hate crimes occur within their jurisdiction. So we're talking about a very narrow subset of the actual crime problem. And on the other side of that, the Justice Department does national crime victim surveys, which indicate there are about 230,000 hate crimes each year, half of which are not reported to law enforcement for various reasons. But the law enforcement agencies that report to the uniform crime reports only report about 8,000 hate crimes a year. The federal government has 5 federal hate crime statutes, but only prosecutes about 25 defendants each year. So quite a disparity there. And not that I think that a victim's belief that the crime was racially or ethnically motivated necessarily will always comport with the facts that are accessible to law enforcement. But we have somewhere between 25 and 230,000 hate crimes each year. That's a pretty wide gap. And so typically what I have seen since I worked these cases in the 1990s is that for whatever reason, there will be attention brought to these groups, and then law enforcement will start to focus on them, and the media will start to focus on them, and the public will become concerned about them. And then there's a lot of reporting that later gets called a rise in this violence, when what we have to understand is this violence is persistent throughout time. And what we have to understand is that law enforcement doesn't focus on this as a matter of course. In fact, today, the FBI could not tell you how many people white supremacists killed last year, or the year before that, or the year before that. They could tell you how many bank robberies happened. They could tell you how many bank robberies involved the use of a weapon, and which involved the use of a note. They could tell you whether there was a getaway driver in every bank robbery, but they can't tell you how many people white supremacists killed, because they don't go out and collect that data. And part of the problem is that there are, if a white supremacist kills somebody, there are basically 4 ways that could be addressed. That could be treated as an act of domestic terrorism, in which case it would be the FBI's #1 priority, and there would be a broad investigation trying to identify like-minded individuals that may have played a role in that crime and the conspiracy. It could be described as a hate crime. And if the FBI treats it as a hate crime, it drops down to the #5 priority. It's a civil rights violation. And the case would be worked specifically to determine the motivation for that crime. So it would be very individually focused. And that's if the FBI investigated it at all, because the Justice Department policy is to defer hate crime prosecutions to state and local law enforcement, which of course we know from the uniform crime reports, most state and local agencies don't work these cases. So it could disappear into the ether. The FBI actually prosecutes most of its cases targeting white supremacists through its violent crimes program, which treats them as gangs. And of course, the other murders happen that never come to the FBI's attention, and they get treated as murders and if the police don't identify it as a white supremacist murder, there's nothing for the press to write about. So a lot of the violence that these groups perpetrate is sort of lost in the lack of reporting and accounting for this violence. But certainly over the last several years, we have seen increased attention to white supremacist activity and white supremacist violence. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that we had a presidential candidate who was making racist statements that seemed to be something that would appeal to these groups. Unfortunately, I think some of the reporting contributed to the problem, because what you have to understand about these groups is there's no barrier to entry. You can call yourself the leader of whatever state you're in, militia, and you're it, right? If you have a piece of paper, you can write your name and under it, Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan for my local community, and you are the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan for your local community. Nobody's going to come around and say you're not. And you might have 0 followers, but if some major media outlet looks up your website and finds it and then goes out and interviews you as the Grand Dragon of the local Ku Klux Klan, all of a sudden you're going to find your phone ringing, right? The communities typically targeted by hate crimes don't have good relationships with the police. They're the communities that are often improperly targeted by the police. So that's part of it. And they don't trust the police. They don't want the police to come into their neighborhood, so they're not going to call them. No mayor wants to be the state leader in hate crimes, right? So when your police commissioner comes to you and says, hey, look at all these hate crimes we're going to report. No, we're trying to get some multinational company to build a factory here. We don't want to be known as the hate crime capital of the world. So there's a lot of good reasons why the police don't report.